Welcome back, everyone. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. His name is Jonathon Fairall. Is it Fairall, John? Sorry, Fairall.
It is indeed Fairall, yes.
Sorry, Jonathon Fairall. Jonathon is an Australian journalist and author. This evening he was speaking about the Earl Grey scheme, Irish Famine Orphans in Australia. He is author of Earl Grey's Daughters, The Women Who Changed Australia, published in 2019. It tells the story of refugees from the famine who endured the long um, sea journey to find a new life in Australia. He's also author of 2 historical books and also writes about science and technology for newspapers and magazines. I'll let you commence when you're ready, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening. And I'd like to start, I guess, by expressing my appreciation to Dolores and the other officials at the council for organising this conference and allowing me the opportunity to speak to you about the Earl Grey scheme. My story is particularly apt, I think, in a conference series that's dedicated to the ripples of history. This is the story of how an Irish catastrophe helped shape history on the far side of the world. What I want to do over the next 15 minutes or so is describe the scheme and then to take you down one of history's byways, examine how it arose, and then look at the consequences that it had for Australia and for Australian history. I should say, so for them, I'm not a professional historian. I got interested in this subject when I discovered that my wife's father's mother's mother was an orphan from Ireland. I was incredulous. What would induce the Irish to send their young girls to the other side of the world, I wondered. Well, I did enough research to reveal what happened, slightly more revealed why. So I wrote a book about it. And if you're interested, go to SPSPpublishing.com.au and they will sell you a copy. The Earl Grey scheme was a plan to rid Irish workhouses of young female orphans by sending them to Australia. From an Irish point of view, the numbers involved were inconsequential. Around 500,000 Irish fled to England, half to North America during the famine years. So the 4,269 orphaned girls involved in this scheme would hardly have caught your attention. But if you think the numbers of people involved in the scheme were inconsequential, the view from here is a little different. In 1840, there were only 200,000 settlers in Australia, and the Irish were an important part of that. At the turn of the 20th century, when the colonies finally federated to create modern Australia, something like a quarter of the population had Irish roots. Either they were Irish born or mum and dad were. The result was that Australia was more Irish than any other country on earth except Ireland itself. And that situation only ended with the era of large-scale immigration in the 1950s after the Second World War. So, what was the background? Why did it happen? Well, human physiology dictated that in the extreme conditions that existed in the workhouses during the famine years, girls did rather better than boys, or at least they didn't die as fast. There seems little doubt that females can tolerate extreme food scarcity better than males. This was exacerbated by the normal idiosyncrasies of society. It was desirable for men and young boys to leave the workhouses and seek their fortune. Females who were part of intact families should leave as soon as they could. But orphan girls had no options. There were, in truth, few ways to earn a living in 1850s Ireland, for men or women. But the opportunity for a woman to earn her own keep were few and far between. The result was that most workhouses in Ireland had a flock of young girls who had no future. The normal courting and mating rituals that would have led to marriage and children could not be countenanced in a workhouse. They couldn't be discharged into the responsibility of a family because there wasn't one. There were few or no acceptable ways for them to earn their own keep. So they and their guardians were trapped. By 1848, when the famine was at its height, the number of orphaned girls was causing growing concern among the members of the boards of guardians of most workhouses across the country. What was to happen to them? Well, on the other side of the planet, they had the opposite problem. If you know anything about Australian history, you'll know that it was settled by convicts from England. The English had been in the habit of exporting their problems to the Caribbean and the North American colonies for over 200 years. But when the Americans declared independence in 1776, that was no longer tenable. So the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay in 1788. For the next 50 years or so, the English used Australia as a dumping ground, not only for criminals, but also for political prisoners. Many an Irish revolutionary entered Australian folklore by this route. Well, this bald recounting of Australia's origin story covers up many layers of complexity. One is that from the time of the Second Fleet, there were free settlers in Australia. English criminals were a tiny minority of the population. From the start of the 19th century, free men formed a rapidly swelling majority. They had opinions, and they were not backwards in making sure the colonial authorities knew what they were. It didn't take long for an anti-transportation sentiment to emerge among them. A second point to make is that the population was overwhelmingly male. Convicts were, of course, almost exclusively male, but a free settler was typically a young man trying his luck, not a woman in search of a new life. In the First Fleet, there were 548 males and 188 females among the convicts. That's more or less 3 to 1. But over time, it got much worse. In 1850, in some parts of the country, there were 17 men for every woman. It's not surprising. For English men, especially from the lower middle and working classes, Australia was, from day one, a land of extraordinary opportunity. For women, it was quite different. Colonial authorities knew this was a problem. Their attitudes were summed up by a famous feminist writer in the 1970s who entitled her book, Damned Wars and God's Police. Convict women, they thought, were mostly the former, but virtuous female immigrants would be the latter. As a result, from the 1820s onwards, there had been schemes to encourage young women to emigrate to the colonies. By and large, they were a failure. It was simply too hard to make a frontier life attractive to women. During the famine years, the Secretary for War and the colonies was Earl Henry Grey. Henry was the third Earl Grey. He was the son of the second Earl, who's still famous for his interest in tea. Well, given what I've said so far about Irish and Australian demographics, it wasn't surprising when, in 1848, Grey put 2 and 2 together and proposed a scheme for shipping the surplus young females in Irish workhouses to Australia. These new migrants would form a battalion of God's police, and while nature was taking its course, they would work as scullery maids or as other forms of domestic help. So it was that the Sobrayans sailed through Sydney Heads in April 1848 with 53 young women on board. Over the next few years, 23 ships departed Plymouth every 2 months or so, mostly with about 200 orphan girls. The expectation was this would ramp up to about 20,000 people annually. For a while, it seemed to work. It would seem most of the girls were welcomed into their new homes. They got jobs within a few weeks. As far as we can tell, there was very little exploitation. On the trip out, the ship's doctor was explicitly charged with their protection. When they arrived, they were housed in converted barracks and work was found for them at preordained set rates of pay. Then, as they moved into the community, their employers were expected to see to their spiritual and physical welfare. Sometimes things went wrong. Some ship's doctors took advantage of the situation. Many employers did. But on average, they did well. It took them 2 years to find a husband. And once again, on average, they went on to have 9 children each. My wife's granny had 13 kids, 12 of whom lived to maturity. The contribution they made to the Australian population was out of all proportion to their small numbers. However, problems with the scheme began almost at once. In the first place, the mechanics of the scheme were not trivial. The voyage itself was risky. More importantly, it was expensive. The immigrants needed to be supported and ship owners compensated for a 4 to 6 months voyage. To give you some idea of the numbers involved, the going price for a ticket to Australia in 1850 was about 20 quid. Similar ticket up the St. Lawrence Seaway would cost about £2. And this was at a time when the average annual wage in Australia was about £1. At the political level, things went sour very quickly. In 1848, when the first of the famine refugees began to arrive, the main political issue in all the colonies was the continued transportation of prisoners from England. Earl Grey was very much for transportation, and when he heard that wealthy landowners in the colony wanted more free labor, he began enthusiastically emptying the local jails. Things came to a head in 1849 when a prison transport was greeted by mass demonstrations in Sydney. Earl Grey was pilloried in the press and forced to retreat. Although it took many years to formally ratify, it was the end of transportation. Now, suddenly, here was a second scheme concocted by Earl Grey, this time to bring in Irish orphans. The colonists demanded a say in the type of migrant being brought out. This was especially so when it became apparent that the scheme was being funded by colonial land taxes. After the American example, Whitehall was sensitive to colonial opinion. The money problem was certainly an issue, but the real problem was that the overwhelming majority of the girls in the Earl Grey scheme were Catholic. As I said earlier, there was a sizable Irish Catholic minority in the Australian colonies, but there was no doubt that power resided in the hands of the majority Protestants. Nor should there be any doubt but that the bigotry that had disfigured Ireland and England since King Henry's day had been imported into the colonies. Indeed, Catholic and Protestant antagonism was one of the defining characteristics of Australian society. Mixed marriages between adherents to the two sects were a rarity, and this situation lasted right into the 1950s, when a tidal wave of immigration from Catholic Europe made a mockery of English prejudice. There was never any anti-Catholic legislation in the Australian colonies that affected entry to universities or the professions. There was some de facto segregation in some workplaces, but Catholics never suffered the kind of economic disadvantage they did in the UK. For all that, the Catholic-Protestant divide was a part of the economic structure the Earl Grey girls found when they arrived. For the next 2 years, the local press was full of such anti-Catholic vitriol that the Colonial Office began to fear for the safety of the girls. The scheme was abandoned. It was made quite clear that future immigration to the colony would be a matter for authorities in Australia. By the 1840s, the colonies were typical agrarian societies. Some of the early settlers had discovered that they could make good money out of sheep. The business of the colonies was selling wool and meat to England. In large part, the way it worked was that the second son of the second son would get off the boat, have dinner with the governor, and, provided he could demonstrate he had capital behind him and was a good character, he'd be given a tract of land on which to run sheep. Good character was code for being of the right social class and the right Christian sect. These were the so-called squatters. The squatter would need to put together a workforce, buy his sheep, and outlay sufficient cash to keep the group functioning. Of course, only a tiny fraction of immigrants had this level of capital. They formed a land-owning elite, the squattocracy. The rest, who had neither land nor capital, became the workforce. The result of this was an intensely stratified society. There were a few rich sheep farmers and lots of penniless workers who did all the grunt work. In the nature of the case, most of the Earl Grey girls, who came from the least pecunious sector of Irish society, were intended as mothers of the next generation of landless labourers. If all this sounds familiar, it should. In fact, it's a pretty good description of the Irish economy, and Irish society indeed, in 1850. This all came to a head with the push for self-government during the 1850s. There is an argument that says that Ireland was the model for the proposed constitutions in the colonies. There were even proposals for an Australian aristocracy. Curiously, the move for self-government in the Australian colonies was not motivated by the kind of fervour mustered by the American revolutionaries. It was money that did it. The move to self-government was motivated in both Whitehall and the colonies by the discovery of gold in 1851, 2 years after the Earl Grey girls arrived. Most of those who actually grubbed for gold wound up poor and disillusioned. Various Australian gold rushes underpinned a wave of prosperity over the next 20 years, which utterly disrupted social relationships in the country. The population increased. In 1841, there were about 200,000 Europeans in the Australian colonies. 20 years later, in 1860, there were 1.1 million, and they were all much richer than before. Landowners found they had to double salaries to hold on to their shepherds. Dreams of an Australian aristocracy died as newly minted millionaires who didn't know the right way to hold a knife and fork swaggered down the streets of Sydney and Melbourne. As you would expect, some of the Earl Grey girls suffered horribly from their experiences in the famine. Moving to the colony didn't improve things. Today, we would say they had post-traumatic stress disorder. They must have, all of them, been flawed by homesickness on occasion. But if that was their only suffering, they were lucky. Some were made pregnant by their employers. Some were raped. A few, brutalized by their circumstances, committed suicide. Some just gave up and died young. Some pined away, their hearts broken by an indifferent and uncaring world. But they were by no means all victims. Many railed against their employers. The records are full of hard words and violence, court cases and fines. Many were resourceful enough to carve out a good and meaningful life on their own terms. Others made the most of the opportunities that came their way. Not a few wound up owning significant amount of lands and a real stake in the future of the country. My wife's granny was one of those fortunate ones. A poor peasant's daughter from County Offaly, she died a respected and wealthy matriarch. But rich or poor, successful or not, they all of them left a mark on their new country. And thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll certainly have a go at answering them.
Thank you very much, John. I think you've made an important point how they left a mark, and certainly many did achieve great opportunities. The question did come up in an earlier talk, the pros and cons of this scheme, and what it was a very positive opportunity for many as well. George, you want to unmute? Sorry, go ahead.
Look, it was. This was by no means a forced emigration scheme. For some reason, which I'm not quite clear of, the British Admiralty was involved. They sent a selection party. It was headed by Lieutenant Henry, I think, was the man's name, who did a trip in 1846, 1847, I think, to all the workhouses, and selected girls. And basically, what happened was all the likely girls were brought downstairs, stood in a row. Lieutenant Henry walked up and down the lines and said, "You look like the right sort of girl to go. Would you like to go to Australia?" Now, of course, the fact of the matter is most of these girls would have had absolutely no idea where Australia was. They would have had absolutely no idea what was involved. They would have had absolutely no idea of what their future prospects would be. But I guess they would have had a pretty good idea what their prospects would be if they'd stayed in Ireland. And they were not good. So in that sense, for all of them, it was an opportunity. Now, for all the usual reasons, some of those girls could take advantage of those opportunities, and some of them couldn't. Some of them had bad luck. Some of them had good fortune. But yes, you're right. They all did make a mark.
Do you know, John? Sorry, Jared, can you unmute yourself if you want to add to this at all? But just briefly though, one of the questions was, what were the conditions like on the ships? Do you know have you any information on that, John?
Well, this goes back to the earlier point of let's not superimpose modern expectations on an old situation. I mean, you would not have enjoyed the trip, and I certainly wouldn't have. But I think by that time, this was 1850. All right, the British had a lot of experience by that time of moving civilians around the world. They could send people to India, not seamen, but they could send people to India. They could send people to North America. They could come backwards. They could go back and forth and run an empire. So they knew how to do it. They knew how to keep people alive. And the second point to remember is that the second fleet, the second convict fleet, the first convict fleet, there were very, very few deaths. Most of the convicts and all their jailers got off the ship fit and healthy. The second fleet suffered very bad mortality rates. Not only were the mortality rates bad, but most of the people who got off the ships were basket cases. And especially, they were not fit for work. So the implication was that a colony which was essentially starving at the time got lumbered with all these people getting off a ship who needed enormous amounts of care. So Australian colonial authorities, as a result of that experience, had an absolute horror of people getting off ships who weren't fit and healthy. And there was a whole system in place to make sure, for instance, ships' captains were only paid for the passage of a passenger when the passenger got off the ship and when they were healthy. So it ensured, so without government imprimatur, that simple regulation alone ensured that the conditions on board were at least comfortable enough to survive. And indeed, most of the records by ship's captains, by ship's doctors who were looking after the girls, say that the real issue they faced was boredom more than anything else. And that there were, all the things that happen when you've got 200 girls who have absolutely nothing to do, locked below decks on a ship. I think probably the first couple of weeks when they were at sea sailing across the Bay of Biscay must have been absolutely horrible. Everyone would have been seasick. It would have been thoroughly miserable. But I guess when they got down where it was warmer, they probably had quite a nice time.
Thank you. It is certainly hard to consider or comprehend our journey of 4 to 6 months. As you say, very difficult, but the regulations in place actually ensured that it was relatively safe and journey to ensure that the ships had an interest in making sure everyone arrived safely. As you said, that they weren't getting paid. Jared, do you have any comment here?
Yeah, it's interesting when we compare the term that was used at the start of the night, human trafficking, and then with what Jonathon's described, and it's much more nuanced than that. I think that sort of language is rather incongruous when we're dealing with a subject like this. And yes, I've looked in depth at workhouse minute books in Leitrim and also throughout Ulster, and there is a stage where the workhouses are moving through the various stages of the famine, with the huge numbers coming in initially, then the numbers dying. Bergen being one of the worst episodes as well. Then moving into closing down temporarily for maybe a month, 2 months, putting stress on the relief committees and moving, and then you get to the summer of 47 into 48, and the orphans are being picked out to go to Australia to see this in all the workhouses. But they didn't take it easy. The Belfast girls, for example, they kicked up hell on the journey, and they were noted as getting drunk on a regular basis, cursing and swearing at the fellas on board the ship. And also, it wasn't this idea of compliant young girls sitting there being told what to do and then land in Australia. And again, a similar thing. There's a couple of workhouse museums in the country, but Carrickmacross has a special emphasis on the orphan girls, and they've reconstructed the suitcases that they would have been used, and the clothes, that sort of stuff, and it's well worth a visit if you're interested in this particular aspect of the subject.
Just for anybody listening, Carrickmacross is well, the whole building isn't in existence, but part of the original workhouse has been restored. It's in County Monaghan in the Republic of Ireland. Thank you, Jared. John, do you anything else you wanted to say there, or?
Yeah, well, just about those. Well, actually, yeah, there are a couple of things. One was just about those cases. Yeah, each girl was given a case, and it was about, I don't know if I said a meter by probably 500 mils, maybe by 500 mils in dimensions, into which she put all her stuff. And this became a bit of a these cases became a bit of a talisman for these girls as they grew up and grew older. The idea being, my wife's great granny used to say that that everything that she owned was in her case, and that was the best time of her life. When I started doing research on this, I was never really quite sure what she meant by that, except maybe that it does tell you that a lot of these girls were optimistic and hopeful that they were going to have that they were going to something better. The second point I wanted to make, which goes back to something that Jared was saying earlier on, is that there was a lot of controversy in Ireland itself about this scheme at the time, and these allegations are by no means new. I mean, the idea that these girls are being shipped out to be husbands to bushrangers and ruffians and criminals in the Australian bush, for instance, was common currency in the Irish newspapers at the time. So, and I guess it was also common currency that British policy towards Ireland in general was one of ethnic cleansing, or that let everybody die because it'd be some kind of solution to the Irish problem that had been plaguing Britain, for 100 years. My own reading of the sources is that certainly you can explain everything by understanding laissez-faire economics. I mean, bear in mind, this was the time of Corn Laws. This was the time when these new ideas about capitalism, Adam Smith and all that kind of stuff was really coming to the fore. And the view was Malthusian. Let the Irish starve. Those that survive will be richer and they'll be able to feed themselves. And I think that probably explains not only British policy towards Ireland in general, but it explains the Earl Grey scheme.
An element, though, of how people perceive the Earl Grey scheme without knowing maybe a lot of information about it, I suppose, is the fact that the ages of these girls who left, they were very young. But again, I suppose this comes back, but again, this comes back to an extent as well, and how we do our expectations of age and our expectations at the time of someone 14, 15 is very different to what we expect of someone 14, 15 now.
Today, exactly.
With that, completely. A number of people have commented here, John, they really appreciate your talk. They've enjoyed it and have found it very balanced, which they a very balanced talk tonight. Someone has actually commented or asked a question that approximately 40,000 Irish convicts were transported to Australia. 25% were women. Were the Earl Grey girls part of these numbers? I can confirm they weren't part of those numbers. This is completely separate to those who are transported to Australia as convicts.
Yeah,
isn't that correct?
That's absolutely right. They are completely separate. Although, interestingly enough, I mean, it is certainly a source of confusion in the Australian press at the time. I mentioned in my presentation that transportation ended just at the time the Earl Grey scheme started. But actually, that's not quite correct. Transportation to New South Wales certainly ended, But transportation to Van Diemen's Land, or what we now call Tasmania, continued for another 10, 20 years after that. And there's evidently some confusion in people's minds as to the difference between Irish Catholic orphan girls and transported criminals. And they're both lumped into the same category of people who came to the country as, in some sense, ne'er-do-wells. And yeah, so I mean that undercurrent is certainly there.
Someone has commented here that Dr. Perry McIntyre in Sydney manages the Irish Famine Memorial website. I know of this website myself. It is a fantastic resource which lists the details of over 4,000 of the girls who went to Australia. It also provides information such as what ship they went on, what age they were. It provides some details of where they came from here on the island, and actually there's actually some details on their early years in Australia. And that website, I actually will share that with everybody via email, because it is a fantastic resource without a doubt. And it brings it, I think it brings to home the impact of the scheme when you see such a variety of ages. Well, they're all kind of teenagers, but what we see as teenagers today, but their religious backgrounds from every town, really, you know, every workhouse. So certainly a fantastic resource.
Yeah, well, as I said earlier, my understanding is that the selection committee visited every workhouse in Ireland as part of the scheme, and I don't think that there was any prejudice one way or the other for any particular region in Ireland. It just wasn't a consideration.
Yes, someone's geographical location or their religious background or anything like that was irrelevant. It was really very much a case whether suitable or not. Very much so. And I will email everyone the link because it is a fantastic resource to look up. And again, it probably brings it very much kind of back to home. When you see girls listed from, I did a little bit of research from that website, and I will circulate it to those, especially those who are resident here in Northern Ireland. And when you see local towns like Market Hill, Armagh, Banbridge, Raffer Island mentioned on the names of the girls and their ages, it very much does bring it home, which is fantastic. Again, comments, everybody's really enjoyed the presentations tonight, which is fantastic. I know it's getting late here. Jared, do you have any other questions or comments before we close up for the evening?
No, I just think, you know, tonight just reflects the ethos of the seminar program, you know, that it's wide ranging and subjects that may seem like at a tangent when you're focusing on the main aspect of 1845 52, you know, the outdoor relief and the workhouses actually are very nuanced and can go into great depth themselves, you know. So, I mean, like everybody else, looking forward to next week's lectures.
Can I just ask one final question before you go, John? You mentioned that the cost of traveling to Australia then was £20, okay? And it was did you say £2 to Canada?
Yeah, I believe £2 to Canada.
So what would £20, does anybody know, what would £20 equate to maybe today? I just, of course, serious amount of money, but does anybody, Jared, would you have any idea? Or John?
Well, I can give you a practical example. If the average wage was a pound, whether that's the average or the minimum, I'm not sure. But if it was a pound, then what we're saying is that it's 20 years' salary.
It's serious.
So,
serious investment.
That's what you earn. Multiply it by 20, and that's what it cost you to get to Aussie.
And you had previously mentioned in another talk, John, about how the scheme, it was a relief measure to also relieve pressure on the workhouses here in Ireland too. But I suppose that is also a reflection on how bad things were, that this investment was been made to get these girls to Australia.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think it goes to a point that I heard, I can't remember, one of the speakers made earlier on, which was that the workhouses themselves, the economic basis of the workhouses was really problematic. And it became more so as the famine went on. And I guess 1848, 49, the workhouses were really stretched. the workhouse finances were really stretched.
Just someone's coming here for a question, which is important. Any of the girls, did any of them use it as an opportunity to join family already in Australia? Or is there a chance that once some of these girls went, did any family follow to Australia? Do we any no I know it's
Oh,
probably
yes. Yes, I know quite a bit about this. In the case of my own granny, the lady that I followed, she came out in 1850. She came out with a sister. In 1852, her cousin followed, and in 1860, her brother followed. And this was a deliberate policy by the colonial governments to have to link up families. And basically, what you could do was you could in Australia you could buy a subsidized ticket and then send it over to Ireland for a passage to Australia.
so
And
those
this
girls
seems to be very common.
and so
very
those
common story.
girls taking the opportunity to go to Australia for those who were able to, for like you use the term maybe family reunification in some ways today we'd use that
Yes.
term. It had a major economical impact then on family members they were able to actually bring over. And that's something that probably it would be interesting to look at another date, you know. If it wasn't for that girl going, her other siblings who later came, the impact that it had on the rest of the family.
I must say that's not something that I researched. I didn't really think about. I did research it. I researched it from an Australian perspective, but I never researched it from an Irish perspective. I never thought about what the implications of that would have been for the people who stayed behind in Ireland.
And it's something we wouldn't have considered earlier on this evening, but interesting now to actually be able to consider that and think, wow, what an opportunity was created for all the family members. You know, when there would have been no opportunities in the first place. George, do you want to briefly add to this before we finish up?
Really. I mean, it's interesting because the standard thing is the sibling migration to America, where one or two go out and then the money's sent back gradually to bring the next one out, and then that followed, and that was very common to hence the term it's money from America. It was sent through and easily got. So, but it's just interesting to think at, and it shows you how poor Ireland was, that people felt the need that they had to go to the other side of the world, never return to their homeland. And as Jonathon said there about, some of them pined away, some of the girls who went originally, and some committed suicide, some were incredibly homesick. But it's a different perspective on the subject.
Joan mentions here that in one case she's aware of, there were 3 girls who went on one ship. Their mother then went as a matron on a ship, and they were later joined by their father, who had been previously transported to Van Diemen's Land. More children were born to the family. So it was a reflection on the journeys families go through to survive. And
I wrote a book in the late 90s. It was a fairly small effort, Leitrim from the Great Hunger, and in there I outlined the girls who went from the 3 houses, workhouses, Manor Hamilton, Carrigan, Shannon, and Muhull. And after reading that book, one woman in Australia was able to pinpoint who her great grandmother had gone out in 1847, 48.
Yeah. No, John, thank you so much for your talk this evening. We really appreciate it. It's great to it's great to hear it from someone who's actually done the research on the other end of the world. And as you said, there's a family connection there, so we really appreciate it. And certainly the feedback has been wonderful here tonight.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for reaching out.